In the heart of New York City, nestled within the architectural marvel of a skyscraper that pierced the clouds, lay a sanctuary for the world's elite, the Gilded Scepter. Its most exclusive chamber, the Sovereign's Room, was a place where nations were carved up over dessert and fortunes were made or broken with the whisper of a single word. The air itself felt heavy, saturated with the scent of old money, rare leather, and the ghost of truffle oil lingering from 1,000 decadent meals. Walls of dark, polished mahogany absorbed all sound, creating an almost sacred silence broken only by the discreet clinking of silver against porcelain. A single, colossal crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, not merely illuminating the room but dripping light onto the occupants below, its facets refracting the city's distant glow into a constellation of frozen stars. The velvet curtains, the color of dried blood, were so thick they seemed to swallow the very notion of an outside world, insulating this inner sanctum from the realities of the city that bustled and struggled far beneath its gilded windows. This was not just a room, it was a theater of power, a vacuum-sealed environment where the titans of industry played their games, and the price of entry was a net worth with at least 9 zeros. Moving through this silent, opulent theater was Lena Hassan, a ghost in a crisp, black uniform. To the powerful men who occupied the room's single, massive table, she was less than a person. She was a function, a pair of hands that refilled water glasses and cleared plates with practiced, silent efficiency. Her movements were fluid and economical, designed to be unnoticed, to blend into the rich tapestry of the room's decor. But beneath this placid surface of professional invisibility, a storm of memory and intellect raged. Her mind, sharp and restless, was a universe away from the mundane task at hand. While her hands poured still water from a heavy crystal pitcher, her thoughts were cataloging the subtle shifts in body language at the table, the predatory gleam in one man's eyes, the nervous tremor in another's hand. She felt the weight of her existence as a constant, dull ache behind her eyes. Every deferential nod, every quiet, "Excuse me," was a betrayal of the woman she was supposed to be, a scholar whose mind was once celebrated in the hallowed halls of Columbia University. This room, with its suffocating luxury, was both her prison and her penance, the price she paid every single day for a love that knew no bounds. That love had a name, her father. In her mind's eye she could see him, not as he was now, a silent figure confined to a sterile white bed, his world shrunk to the 4 walls of a small room, but as he once was. She remembered the smell of solder and hot coffee in his small workshop, the vibrant energy that radiated from him as he sketched out lines of code that were pure poetry. He was an innovator, a creator who believed technology could build a better world. That world had been shattered by a hostile takeover, a brutal corporate maneuver that was as swift as it was merciless. She remembered the endless nights he spent hunched over legal documents, his face growing grayer with each passing day, the light in his eyes slowly dimming until it was extinguished by the massive stroke that stole his voice, his mobility, and his life's work. The doctors called it a cerebrovascular accident, a clinical, sterile term, but Lena knew what it was. It was a murder of the soul, executed not with a weapon but with a signature on a contract. Her current life, the endless shifts, and the feigned subservience, was a desperate attempt to hold back the tide of medical bills that threatened to drown what little was left of their family. The irony was a blade that twisted in her gut daily. Here she was, pouring water for men who casually gambled with sums that could fund her father's care for 100 lifetimes, while the very tool that could have saved her family lay dormant within her. Her secret skill felt more like a cruel joke from fate. She had a masterful command of Arabic, a fluency that went far beyond mere conversation. Hers was the language of power, of law, of diplomacy. She had spent years at Columbia, delving into the intricate nuances of Middle Eastern corporate contracts, her doctoral thesis poised to be a groundbreaking work on the linguistic loopholes used in predatory acquisitions. She could recall the scent of the university library, the dry, dusty perfume of ancient legal texts, the thrill of deciphering a complex clause in a 12th century trade agreement. That academic obsession, a love for her heritage woven into a brilliant legal mind, was now utterly useless. It was a key to a kingdom she could no longer enter, a powerful weapon locked away while she fought a war of attrition with napkins and water pitchers. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The heavy mahogany doors of the sovereign's room swung open, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. It was as if a barometric pressure drop had occurred, a sudden chill cutting through the carefully climate-controlled air. Khalid al-Jamil did not simply enter a room, he conquered it. He was a man sculpted from arrogance and tailored in bespoke fabric that probably cost more than Lena's annual salary. His presence was an assault, a declaration of his own importance that required no words. He moved with the predatory grace of a shark, his eyes sweeping across the space and dismissing everything in it as either an obstacle or a tool. He gave the restaurant manager a curt, dismissive nod that was more of an insult than a greeting, and didn't even register Lena's existence as she stood discreetly by the service station. His entourage, a collection of nervous-looking men in equally expensive suits, scurried behind him, their deference only serving to amplify his aura of absolute, unquestionable authority. He was the living embodiment of the soulless corporate power that had crushed her father, the kind of man who saw the world not in terms of people, but of assets to be liquidated. The meeting commenced, a tense ballet of corporate maneuvering. Khalid sat at the head of the table, a king holding court. Opposite him was an American investor, a man with a cautious, calculating expression, and beside Khalid sat his translator, a young man whose face was already beaded with a thin sheen of nervous perspiration. The conversation began in English, a dance of pleasantries and veiled threats, the language of a multi-billion-dollar deal. Lena moved silently around them, her actions so practiced they were automatic, leaving her mind free to observe and analyze. She watched Khalid's technique, the way he would lean back with feigned disinterest when a point was made against him, the subtle tap of his fingers on the table that betrayed his impatience. He was a master of psychological warfare, using long, uncomfortable silences and sudden, sharp questions to keep his opponent off balance. The translator struggled to keep up, his voice lacking the steely confidence of his employer, a pale echo of the Titan's will. The entire room felt like a coiled spring, the tension tightening with every passing moment. Then, with a smug, conspiratorial smile directed at his own team, Khalid switched languages. The shift to Arabic was sudden, a deliberate tactic to exclude the American investor, to create a secret space in the open where he could speak without filter. He began discussing a specific clause in the contract, a particularly predatory one Lena recognized from her studies. He used the term asterisk, istihwad qasri, asterisk, a legally loaded phrase that went far beyond a simple business deal. He spoke with a casual cruelty, outlining the brutal efficiency with which the clause would strip the target company of its assets, leaving it a hollowed-out shell. His tone was dismissive, as if he were discussing something as trivial as the weather. The translator, visibly paling, listened intently. When Khalid finished, the young man cleared his throat and turned to the American investor. He hesitated, then offered a sanitized, softened version of the truth. He translated the term as a forceful acquisition, deliberately omitting the nuance of coercion and illegality that the Arabic phrase implied. He chose diplomacy over accuracy, a fatal error in the court of Khalid al-Jamil. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Khalid's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, contorted into a canvas of pure fury. He didn't raise his voice. He lowered it, his words dripping with a cold, concentrated venom that was far more chilling than any shout. In a torrent of harsh, guttural Arabic, he turned on his translator. "You are worthless," he hissed, the words slicing through the tense silence of the room. Did I hire an interpreter or a coward? I speak of conquest, and you translate it as a business negotiation. Your ignorance is an embarrassment to me and to your own language." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into the terrified young man. "You are a child playing with the tools of giants. You soften my words because you lack the stomach for what it takes to build an empire. You are a disgrace." The public evisceration was brutal, designed to humiliate, to break the man down in front of his peers. The American investor stared at his plate, deeply uncomfortable. The other members of Khalid's team looked anywhere but at their condemned colleague. And Lena, standing just a few feet away, holding a heavy water pitcher, heard every single word. As Khalid's final, contemptuous insult hung in the thick, silent air, something inside Lena snapped. It wasn't a loud, violent break, but a quiet, cold crystallization of purpose. The sound of his voice, the specific, cruel cadence of his Arabic, was a key turning a lock deep within her memory. In that moment, the sovereign's room dissolved, and she was standing in the sterile, white hallway of a hospital, the antiseptic smell burning her nostrils, the doctor's gentle but firm voice explaining the catastrophic damage to her father's brain. Khalid's arrogance wasn't just an abstract character flaw. It was the very force that had ripped her world apart. The humiliation of the young translator was a mirror, a perfect reflection of the way her father had been dismissed, devalued, and destroyed by men just like this one. A glacial fury solidified in her veins, not hot and reckless but cold, clear and precise. It steadied her hand, which had begun to tremble. It slowed her breathing, making it deep and even. The invisible waitress, the silent functionary, ceased to exist. In her place stood a scholar, a daughter, and an instrument of a justice that was long, long overdue. The weight of the crystal pitcher in her hand suddenly felt different. It was no longer a tool of service, but a gavel, poised to bring this silent, gilded courtroom to order. The pitcher in Lena's hand was an anchor, a solid point of reality in a room that had suddenly warped around her. Its weight, a familiar strain on her wrist from 1,000 shifts, now felt different, imbued with a new and terrible significance. The cut crystal, designed to catch the light from the chandelier and sparkle for the amusement of wealthy men, seemed to absorb the room's tension, its facets holding 1,000,000 tiny reflections of Khalid al-Jamil's contorted face. Inside her, the carefully constructed walls that separated the waitress from the scholar, the daughter from the employee, crumbled into dust. The fury that had solidified in her veins was not a hot, reckless thing. It was a diamond, forged under the immense pressure of years of silent grief and suppressed intellect. Her father's face floated in her mind's eye, not peaceful in sleep, but ashen and confused in the moments after the stroke, his eyes pleading for an explanation his mouth could no longer form. That image, that sacred and agonizing memory, became the fuel. The decision to speak was not a choice, it was an inevitability, a law of physics. A force of this magnitude, an injustice so profound, could not be met with silence. The universe demanded a correction. With a deliberation that felt as if it were happening outside of time, Lena moved. Her arm, steady as a surgeon's, brought the crystal pitcher from its pouring position and placed it on the polished mahogany of the service credenza behind her. The sound it made was not loud, but it was alien in the tomb-like silence of the sovereign's room. It was a soft, definitive thud of heavy glass on wood, a period placed at the end of a sentence that had gone on for far too long. Every head at the table, which had been studiously averted from the humiliated translator, snapped towards the source of the sound. They saw the waitress, the fixture they had not once granted a second glance, standing with a posture that was no longer deferential. Her shoulders were back, her spine straight, her chin level. She was no longer blending into the woodwork. She was a pillar, suddenly and inexplicably rooted in the center of their universe. The manager, hovering near the door, felt a jolt of pure panic, his mind unable to process this violation of the room's unwritten laws. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the city far below, a world away from this sudden, theatrical silence. Her voice, when it came, was the second shockwave, more powerful than the first. It was not the quiet, almost apologetic tone of a service worker. It was a voice of quiet authority, measured and clear, with a resonance that seemed to emanate from the very floor. It carried the weight of lecture halls and academic symposiums, a voice accustomed to being heard and considered. "Pardon my interruption, Mr. Al-Jamil," she said, and the words themselves were a paradox. The phrase was polite, the kind of thing she was paid to say, but the tone was anything but. It was firm, unwavering, and held not a trace of fear. She spoke in Arabic, but it was a different class of the language entirely from the one Khalid had used. His had been the brutal street-sharp Arabic of the boardroom bully. Hers was the Fusha, the classical, eloquent language of scholars and poets, each consonant perfectly formed, each vowel pure. The very sound of it was a rebuke, a reminder of a deeper, more profound heritage of the language he wielded like a club. The translator's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief and then dawning, miraculous hope in them. She took a single deliberate step forward, her gaze locked on Khalid, who was still frozen, in a state of stunned disbelief. "But your translator was not mistaken," she continued, her voice maintaining its impossibly calm and steady rhythm. "He was being diplomatic. The term you used, istihwad qasri, does not simply mean forceful acquisition, as he so generously interpreted it for your guests." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the thick, suffocating air. She was dissecting his language, his weapon, with the precision of an academic, laying it bare for all to see. The root, asr, implies coercion, duress, an act against one's will. In a legal context, a context I am certain you are familiar with, it denotes a seizure, an appropriation that operates outside the bounds of ethical or even legal frameworks. It is the language of a predator, not a partner. Her explanation was not just a correction, it was an indictment, delivered with the cold, irrefutable clarity of a legal brief. She had taken his power, his native tongue, and turned it against him, with a mastery he could never hope to match. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum in which sound itself seemed to have died. The American investor, who had been looking down at his plate in deep discomfort, slowly raised his head, his eyes fixed on Lena with a look of astonishment and intense curiosity. He understood none of the words, but he understood the power shift that had just occurred. He saw a titan, a man who had commanded the room with sheer force of will, rendered speechless and impotent by a woman in a black uniform. Khalid al-Jamil's face was a theater of conflicting emotions. The initial shock gave way to a flicker of confusion, as if his brain was struggling to categorize this impossible event. Then came the dark, rising tide of pure, undiluted rage. His entire identity was built upon a hierarchy he controlled, a world where waitresses were furniture and his word was law. This woman had not just interrupted him, she had dismantled his authority, exposed his duplicity, and unmasked him in front of his prey, all using his own language. The violation was so total, so complete, that for a moment, he could not even form a response. He finally found his voice, but it was a strangled, rasping thing, the sound of a king whose crown had just been knocked from his head. He did not speak in Arabic now. He reverted to English, the neutral territory, as if his own language had been contaminated, turned against him. His face was pale, a vein throbbing violently in his temple. He slowly raised a trembling finger, pointing it at Lena not as a man giving an order, but as a child having a tantrum. The sophisticated veneer of the corporate raider was gone, stripped away to reveal the raw, ugly core of a bully who had been challenged for the first time. "You," he managed to choke out, his voice thick with venom. "Who do you think you are?" The question hung in the air, absurd in its impotence. He was demanding an identity from a woman who had just demonstrated, with devastating precision, exactly who she was. The waitress was gone, and in her place stood an adversary he had not seen and could not comprehend. The manager, a man named Jean-Pierre, whose entire career was built on anticipating the whims of powerful men, finally snapped out of his paralysis. He saw the trembling finger, the pale face of his most important client, and a tidal wave of pure terror washed over him. His future, the restaurant's reputation, the very ground beneath his feet, all seemed to be dissolving. He scurried forward, his movements jerky and panicked, his face a mask of frantic apology. He didn't even look at Lena. She was no longer a person to him but a problem, a catastrophic error to be deleted. "Mr. Al-Jamil, I am so sorry, so deeply sorry. This is an unforgivable breach, a complete failure of our standards. This will be dealt with immediately, I assure you." His words tumbled out, a desperate, sycophantic flood meant to placate the enraged deity at the head of the table. But Khalid was not looking at him. His eyes, burning with a hatred so intense it was almost personal, were still fixed on Lena. "Get her out," Khalid barked, his voice finally finding its familiar brutal register. The command cut through the manager's babbling apologies. "She is fired, now." He leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. He looked past the manager, his gaze sweeping over the American investor and his own cowed subordinates, making them all witnesses to his decree. "And I want to be clear," he added, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "If I ever see her face in this establishment again, if I even hear that she still works here, I will not simply take my business elsewhere. I will personally ensure this entire building is a crater by the end of the month. I will buy it, and I will demolish it. Do you understand me?" The threat was monstrous, wildly disproportionate, the nuclear response of a profoundly wounded ego. It was not about a waitress anymore. It was about re-establishing his dominance, about scorching the earth where his authority had been challenged. Jean-Pierre flinched as if he had been physically struck. The blood drained from his face, leaving him with a pasty, terrified pallor. He turned to Lena, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. "You heard him," he hissed, his French accent thickening under the stress. "Get your things. You are finished. Go. Now. Before you destroy us all." There was no severance, no protocol, just the raw, primal instinct of self-preservation. Security guards, who had been standing discreetly outside the mahogany doors, were summoned with a frantic wave. They entered the room, their presence a final, jarring intrusion into the sanctum of power. They moved towards Lena, their expressions impassive, trained not to react, only to act. She did not resist. She did not say another word. She held Khalid's gaze for one last moment, her expression unreadable, a calm, deep ocean of purpose. Then, she turned, her back straight, and allowed herself to be escorted from the room she had just conquered and lost in the same breath. As she was being led through the hushed, opulent corridors of the Gilded Scepter, a place that had been her prison for over a year, she felt a strange and unsettling calm. The humiliation of the public firing, the stares of the other staff, the cold finality of the manager's words, none of it could penetrate the shield of her newfound resolve. Her mind was already working, processing, analyzing. And then she heard it. As she passed the still-open doors of the sovereign's room, Khalid's voice, now restored to its full, arrogant volume, carried into the hallway. He was speaking to his team in English, trying to salvage the deal, to smooth over the disruption. "Let's move on," he said dismissively. "The final transfer will be routed through the usual channel. Orion Star Holdings will handle the asset liquidation." The name hit Lena with the force of a physical blow. Orion Star Holdings. A meaningless string of words to anyone else, but to her, it was a ghost from a past she thought was buried. It was the name of the faceless shell corporation she had seen 100 times on the yellowing legal documents stacked in a cardboard box under her bed. The walk out of the restaurant and onto the bustling streets of New York City was a jarring transition from one reality to another. The cold night air hit her face, a shock of sensation after the climate-controlled stillness of the Gilded Scepter. The cacophony of the city, the blare of horns, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of 100 conversations, rushed in to fill the silence that had enveloped her. She stood on the sidewalk, still in her black uniform, a ghost expelled from the machine of wealth and power. The immediate, terrifying reality of her situation began to set in. She was unemployed. The next payment for her father's care facility was due in 2 weeks. The rent on their small Queens apartment was due next week. The carefully constructed, fragile dam holding back a flood of debt and despair had just been dynamited. A wave of panic, cold and sickening, washed over her, threatening to pull her under. For a moment she felt an overwhelming urge to cry, to scream, to collapse right there on the unforgiving pavement. The subway ride home was a descent into a private hell. Surrounded by the tired, anonymous faces of the city's late-night commuters, she felt utterly alone. Her reflection in the dark, vibrating window was a stranger's face, pale and drawn. She saw the ghost of the brilliant Columbia scholar, the ghost of the happy daughter whose father was whole, and the ghost of the invisible waitress she had been just an hour before. All of them were gone. Who was she now? A jobless caregiver with a uselessly brilliant mind and a catastrophic inability to remain silent in the face of injustice. She had thrown away her family's only lifeline for a single moment of defiance. Was it worth it? The question echoed in the rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels against the tracks. The panic began to subside, replaced by a dull, heavy ache of regret. She had spoken truth to power, and power had swatted her away like an irritating insect, leaving her broken and discarded on the side of the road. When she finally arrived at her building, the familiar scent of stale cooking oil and disinfectant in the hallway did nothing to comfort her. She let herself into her small apartment, the silence within its walls a stark contrast to the noise of the city she had left behind. She walked quietly to the door of her father's room and pushed it open a crack. He was asleep, his breathing soft and even in the dim glow of a nightlight. His face, relaxed in sleep, seemed younger, a shadow of the vibrant man he once was. She watched him for a long time, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, a steady beacon in her storm of fear and confusion. This was her why. This was the reason for the endless shifts, the swallowed insults, the crushing weight of her double life. And looking at him now, the regret began to recede, burned away by the returning heat of her anger. The name echoed in her mind again, louder this time, clearer. Orion Star Holdings. It was no longer just a name, it was a key, a connection. A thread linking the arrogant monster in the restaurant to the quiet, broken man in this bed. The weariness fell away from her, replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a clarity of purpose she hadn't felt since her days in the university library. She went to the small closet in the hallway and pulled out a dusty cardboard box, its flaps soft and worn with age. It was filled with her father's old business files, the grim archaeological record of his company's destruction. The air filled with the dry, slightly sweet scent of aging paper as she lifted the lid. For years, she had been unable to look at these documents. They were artifacts of pain, testaments to a battle that had been brutally and decisively lost. But tonight, she opened the box not as a grieving daughter, but as a forensic investigator opening a cold case file. Her fingers, no longer trembling, began to sift through the dense stacks of legal papers. She knew what she was looking for. Her eyes, trained by years of poring over dense legal texts, scanned the documents with a speed and comprehension that would have been impossible just a few hours before. She bypassed the preliminary letters, the initial offers, the pages of meaningless corporate boilerplate. She went straight for the final acquisition agreement, the document that had served as her father's death warrant. Her fingers traced the complex clauses, the predatory language veiled in professional jargon that she now understood all too well. And then she saw it, on the final page, tucked away in the appendix detailing the transfer of assets. The acquiring entity, the legal vessel for the hostile takeover, was listed as a subsidiary, a shell corporation, Orion Star Holdings. The name seemed to burn on the page, a brand searing itself into her consciousness. The connection was no longer a suspicion. It was a fact, cold and hard and irrefutable. And beneath the typed name of the shell corporation was the signature, a bold, arrogant slash of ink, a signature that radiated impatience and utter self-assurance. It was the signature of the man who had authorized the transaction, the architect of her family's ruin, Khalid al-Jamil. The name was a detonation in the quiet of the small apartment. The man who had humiliated a young translator for being too diplomatic. The man who had ordered her fired for speaking the truth. The man who had threatened to demolish a building over a perceived slight. That man, that petty, cruel, arrogant tyrant, was the same one who had systematically and deliberately destroyed her father, broken his spirit, and stolen his life's work for what amounted to a rounding error on his balance sheet. The pieces of her life, the tragic, disconnected fragments of her past and her present, slammed together with the force of a tectonic collision, forming a new, terrifying, and perfectly clear landscape. The grief she had carried for years, a heavy, passive weight of sorrow, underwent a final, violent alchemy. It was not extinguished, it was transmuted. The sorrow became rage, the rage became focus, and the focus became a singular, unshakable mission. The scholar inside her, the woman who had once thrilled at the challenge of deciphering an obscure legal text, was now fully, irrevocably awake. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, a passive survivor adrift in a sea of misfortune. She was an agent of a justice that had been delayed for far too long. Her fight was no longer about paying the next medical bill or keeping a roof over their heads. That was a battle for survival. This was a war for restitution, for accountability, for the soul of the man sleeping peacefully in the next room. She looked at the signature on the page, at the name that had haunted her family from the shadows, and she knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was going to burn his empire to the ground. Her first thought was not of lawyers or reporters. It was of knowledge, of strategy. She needed a guide, someone who understood the complex, treacherous world she was about to enter. A name surfaced from the depths of her memory, a name associated with safety, with intellectual rigor, with respect. Professor Alistair Finch, her doctoral mentor at Columbia. He was a giant in the field of international law, a man whose mind was as sharp as his wit was dry. He had been her champion, the one who had seen the brilliance in her work and pushed her to be better, to dig deeper. He had been devastated when she'd told him she was leaving the program, but he had not judged her. He had simply looked at her with his kind, perceptive eyes and told her that the door would always be open if she ever found her way back. The thought of contacting him now, after so many years of silence, filled her with a complex mixture of hope and shame. She was no longer his star pupil. She was a disgraced waitress. She spent the next hour pacing the small confines of her living room, a battle raging within her. The shame was a powerful deterrent. It whispered that he would see her as a failure, that he would dismiss her story as the rambling of a bitter, vengeful woman. It reminded her of her fall from grace, from the hallowed halls of a prestigious university to the polished floors of a restaurant service corridor. But the image of Khalid's sneering face and the cold, hard proof of his signature on the document in her hands was a more powerful force. Her intellect, so long dormant, was crying out for an outlet, for a problem to solve. Professor Finch was not just a potential ally. He was the key to unlocking the arsenal she so desperately needed. He had the knowledge, the resources, the access to the very systems Khalid al-Jamil had manipulated for his own gain. Swallowing her pride, she found his old contact information, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Her hand trembled as she dialed the number, the familiar tones of the keypad sounding unnaturally loud in the silent apartment. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. She was about to hang up, to give in to the fear and the shame, when a familiar voice, gravelly and warm, answered on the other end. Alistair Finch. Just his name, spoken with the calm authority she remembered so well. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her throat was tight, the words caught behind a dam of emotion. "Professor Finch," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. There was a pause on the other end, and then, "Lena? Lena Hassan? Is that really you?" There was no confusion in his voice, no hesitation. He remembered her instantly, and in his tone she heard not disappointment or judgment, but genuine, unreserved warmth and concern. "My dear girl," he said, "I've wondered where you went. Are you all right?" The simple, kind question was almost her undoing. The dam of emotion cracked, and she had to fight to keep her voice steady. She told him she needed to see him, that it was a matter of extreme urgency and importance. He didn't question her. He simply told her to meet him the next morning at the university, in his office, the same office where they had spent countless hours debating the finer points of international contract law. The next day, walking onto the Columbia campus felt like stepping into another life. The familiar Gothic architecture, the scent of old books and autumn leaves, the energy of students hurrying to class. It was a world she had been exiled from. She felt like a ghost, an intruder in a past she no longer belonged to. But when she saw Professor Finch standing at his office door, his face etched with concern, some of that feeling of alienation began to fade. He greeted her with a warm handshake, led her inside, and closed the door, giving her a space of absolute privacy and safety. He sat behind his large, cluttered desk, his eyes kind but serious, and said simply, "Tell me everything." And so she did. The story poured out of her, not as a rambling, emotional narrative, but as a structured, detailed account. She was a scholar presenting her case. She started with the incident at the Gilded Scepter, detailing Khalid's exact words in Arabic, her correction, and the brutal, swift retribution. Then she presented the second piece of evidence, the name of the shell corporation she had overheard. And finally she laid the old acquisition document on his desk, the one she had brought with her, and pointed to the final page. She pointed to the name, Orion Star Holdings, and the bold, arrogant signature beneath it. She laid out the facts, connecting the petty tyrant from the restaurant to the corporate predator who had destroyed her father. She presented her hypothesis that the man's character, his reflexive cruelty and duplicity, was the key to understanding his business practices. She argued that his public humiliation of the translator was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of the same pathology that allowed him to destroy companies and lives without a second thought. Professor Finch listened with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time in years, truly seen. He picked up the document, his eyes scanning the pages with the speed of a man who had dedicated his life to the language of law. He looked at the signature, then back at Lena, and a grim, hard light entered his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, the old leather groaning in protest. "Khalid al-Jamil," he said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. "He has a reputation, of course, the vulture who picks the bones of innovators. There have always been rumors of unethical practices, of deals that were too good to be true. But he's always been insulated by an army of lawyers and a web of offshore accounts. No one has ever been able to make anything stick." He looked at Lena, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something new in his expression, a hunter's gleam. "Until now, perhaps," he added softly. "A man this arrogant, this convinced of his own impunity, always makes mistakes. He gets sloppy. His fatal flaw, Lena, is the one you just exploited. He underestimates people." He told her that her father's case, on its own, was likely a legal dead end, the contracts too ironclad, the time elapsed too long. But it was no longer just about her father, it was about a pattern of behavior. The key, he explained, was to prove that the destruction of her father's company was not an isolated hostile takeover, but part of a larger, systemic strategy of fraud. They needed to link Orion Star Holdings to other similar acquisitions. They needed to find evidence of insider trading, stock manipulation, or other illegal activities that Khalid used to weaken his targets before he moved in for the kill. The task was monumental, a legal and financial archaeological dig that would require sifting through mountains of data. It was a war of attrition, fought not on a battlefield, but in the digital archives of the Securities and Exchange Commission and international corporate registries. It was a war that required a specific set of skills, a tireless dedication, and a brilliant analytical mind. A slow smile spread across Professor Finch's face. "It seems to me," he said, his eyes twinkling, "that you are uniquely qualified for this particular fight." He stood up and walked over to a computer terminal in the corner of his office. As a former doctoral candidate in good standing who was on an indefinite leave of absence, he said with a theatrical wink, "You still have certain privileges." He typed for a few moments, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I've just reactivated your university credentials. You now have full access to the Columbia Law Library's databases. LexisNexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg Law, our private international corporate archives, the whole arsenal." He turned back to her, his expression now serious. "This will not be easy, Lena. He will fight back and he will fight dirty. But you have something he doesn't. You have the truth. And you have a very personal reason to see it brought into the light." That night, for the first time in years, Lena was not in a waitress's uniform. She was sitting in a carrel deep in the hushed, sacred stacks of the Butler Library, the same carrel where she had spent so many nights of her previous life. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated her face, which was set in an expression of intense, focused concentration. The world outside, the city, her unemployment, the looming bills, it all faded away. She was back in her element, a scholar on the hunt. She began her search, her fingers flying across the keyboard, typing in the name that was now burned into her soul, Orion Star Holdings. She plunged into the digital labyrinth of corporate filings, of subsidiaries and parent companies, of mergers and acquisitions that spanned decades and continents. For hours, she found nothing, just dead ends and shell corporations that led to other shell corporations, a financial hydra designed to be impenetrable. But Lena was not deterred. She was relentless. Then, deep into the night, she found it. It was a tiny thread, a footnote in a decade-old, obscure SEC filing for a completely different company. It was a disclosure of minor shareholders, and for a single fiscal quarter, before it was transferred to another entity, a small block of shares in a tech company that had gone bankrupt had been held by Orion Star Holdings. The bankrupt company was a competitor of her father's, one that had mysteriously collapsed just 6 months before his own company was targeted. It was not a smoking gun. It was not even a clue. It was less than that. It was the scent of a trail, a faint disturbance in the dust of a cold case. But for Lena, sitting in the silence of the library, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky over New York City, it was everything. It was the beginning. The hunt had officially begun, and the prey had no idea that the ghost he had created was now coming for him. The weight of the task ahead was immense. A mountain of legal documents and financial obfuscation designed to protect men like Khalid al-Jamil. Lena knew the path would be fraught with peril, with dead ends designed to exhaust and demoralize any who dared to tread it. The enemy was a billionaire with limitless resources and a demonstrated capacity for ruthless retaliation. She, on the other hand, was a jobless woman with a sick father, armed with nothing more than a library card and a burning, righteous fury. The odds were impossibly, laughably long, but as she looked at the single, tenuous connection on her screen, a link between two victims of the same predator, she did not feel fear. She felt a profound and powerful sense of purpose. The invisible waitress was dead, and the scholar had been reborn, not for the sake of academia, but for the pursuit of a justice that was long overdue. The stage was being set for a confrontation, and this time Lena would be the one writing the script. The library became Lena's sanctuary and her battlefield. The world outside, with its looming rent payments and the constant low-grade hum of anxiety about her father's medical care, ceased to exist the moment she stepped through its heavy oak doors. She operated in the dead of night, a solitary ghost haunting the deserted aisles, when the only sounds were the whisper of the ventilation system and the gentle tap of her own fingers on the keyboard. The scent of old paper and binding glue was a balm to her frayed nerves, a perfume from a life she thought she had lost forever. She fueled herself with lukewarm coffee from a thermos and the cold, hard fury that had become the central organizing principle of her existence. Each night she would sit at her usual carrel, the screen of her laptop casting a pale, determined glow on her face, and dive into the digital abyss. The task was Herculean, a search for a single grain of truth buried beneath a mountain of lies, a mountain meticulously constructed over decades by Khalid al-Jamil's army of lawyers and accountants. Her eyes would burn from staring at endless columns of numbers and dense paragraphs of legal jargon, but she never faltered. The image of her father, his vibrant mind trapped in a silent body, was a constant presence, a silent sentinel standing guard over her resolve, chasing away the encroaching shadows of exhaustion and despair. She waded through an ocean of digital misinformation, a carefully crafted labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore accounts designed to confound and defeat anyone who dared to look too closely. The names were a meaningless litany of corporate poetry: Apex, Orion, Polaris, Nova, celestial bodies used to mask the darkest of terrestrial crimes. The money moved in a dizzying, complex dance across the globe, from the Cayman Islands to Luxembourg, from Panama to Switzerland, a torrent of digital assets that left almost no discernible trail. For weeks, it felt like she was chasing ghosts, following financial threads that would inevitably lead to another anonymous holding company, which would then dissolve into a dozen more, a financial hydra that grew 2 new heads for every one she managed to sever. The frustration was a physical thing, a tight knot in her chest. There were moments, in the lonely hours just before dawn, when the sheer scale of his deception felt insurmountable, when she felt like a single soldier trying to breach an impregnable fortress with her bare hands. But then she would remember the casual cruelty in his voice as he dismantled the translator, the chilling arrogance of his threat to demolish a building over a wounded ego, and the cold knot of frustration would ignite once more into the white-hot fire of her mission. Her first breakthrough came not from a direct assault on Khalid's empire, but from a flanking maneuver. Following the faint trail she had first uncovered, she shifted her focus away from Orion Star Holdings and began a deep forensic dive into the history of Innovate Dynamics, her father's former competitor, the company that had collapsed so mysteriously just before his own was targeted. She spent days piecing together its final year, combing through archived news reports, old investor forums, and delisted stock market data. The official narrative was one of market forces and a failed product launch, a story that was clean, plausible, and utterly false. Lena's mind, honed by years of academic discipline, saw the patterns the rest of the world had missed. She noticed a series of anonymous, highly critical articles published in obscure financial blogs just before a major investor pulled out. She saw a sudden, inexplicable surge in short-selling activity in the weeks leading up to the company's final, fatal stock plunge. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, a campaign of corporate sabotage so subtle and sophisticated that it was invisible to the naked eye. The pieces were there, scattered and disconnected, but she could feel the shape of the conspiracy forming beneath the surface of the official records. The problem was that she was on the outside, looking in. She had the public data, but she needed the private truth. She needed to get inside the machine, to speak to someone who had been there when the gears of Khalid's destructive engine were turning. Professor Finch had been her strategic guide, a source of wisdom and access, but now she needed a different kind of ally. She needed an insider. She needed a ghost, someone who, like her and her father, had been erased by Khalid's ambition. Her research shifted again, from corporations to people. She began compiling a list of key executives who had worked at Innovate Dynamics and at her father's company during the time of the takeovers. She cross-referenced their names with employment records, searching for anyone who had left abruptly, who had been forced into early retirement, or who had signed a non-disclosure agreement under duress. The work was painstaking, a delicate and often frustrating exercise in digital archaeology. After a week of searching, one name stood out: Arthur Vance. He had been the chief financial officer at Innovate Dynamics, a man with a reputation for meticulous, almost obsessive integrity. His career, which had been on a meteoric rise, had come to a sudden and inexplicable end the month after the company was sold for parts. Public records showed he had moved to a quiet suburb in New Jersey, had not worked in finance since, and was living a life of quiet, anonymous seclusion. He was a man who had been silenced. Lena knew in her bones that he was the key. Finding a way to contact him was the next challenge. He had no social media presence, no public profile. He had deliberately made himself hard to find. But Lena was relentless. She used her university's alumni databases to find people who had worked with him 20 years prior, piecing together a social network until she found a former colleague who, after some gentle prodding, reluctantly provided an email address. Her message to Arthur was brief, direct, and carefully worded. She didn't mention Khalid al-Jamil. She simply said she was the daughter of Amir Hassan, and that she was investigating the collapse of companies like Innovate Dynamics. She asked for 10 minutes of his time. The reply came 2 days later, a single terse sentence: "A coffee shop in Montclair, tomorrow, 10 a.m., come alone." The meeting was tense from the moment she walked in. Arthur Vance was a man who looked haunted, his shoulders slumped with the weight of a secret he had carried for years. His eyes, pale and wary, darted around the quiet suburban cafe, as if he expected Khalid's assassins to burst through the door at any moment. He was a ghost, terrified of the world of the living. Lena understood his fear. She didn't press him. Instead, she began by telling him her story, not as an accusation, but as a shared experience. She spoke of her father, of his passion for his work, and of the way his spirit had been broken long before his body. She laid out her research on the table between them, the stock chart showing the coordinated short selling, the timelines of the negative press campaigns. She was not a grieving daughter seeking emotional release. She was a scholar presenting a thesis, her argument built on a foundation of cold, hard facts. She showed him that she already knew the what and the when. She just needed him to provide the how. For a long time, Arthur said nothing. He just stared into his cold cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly. He was a man caught between the terror of speaking and the guilt of his long silence. Lena took one last gamble. She slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of the final acquisition page from her father's company, the page bearing Khalid al-Jamil's bold, arrogant signature. Arthur flinched as if the ink were hot. Seeing that name, that physical proof of the man who had authored his professional death, seemed to break something inside him. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Lena's, and she saw not just fear, but a flicker of the same righteous anger that fueled her. In a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. He told her about a proprietary algorithm Khalid's firm used, a piece of software that could predict and exploit market sentiment, artificially driving down a target stock price. He explained how they used a network of offshore brokerage accounts, all funneling trades through a single, shadowy firm named Argent Tradeworks, to make the manipulation untraceable. He had been ordered to sign off on financial reports he knew were misleading, and had been forced out with a draconian NDA and a threat against his family when he refused. The name, Argent Tradeworks, was the missing piece of the puzzle, the Rosetta Stone she needed to decipher the complex language of Khalid's fraud. Arthur's testimony, while invaluable, was legally useless. He was a terrified witness who would never agree to speak in a courtroom. Lena needed more. She needed irrefutable, digital proof. She took her findings back to Professor Finch, who listened with a grim, focused intensity. He acknowledged the monumental step forward she had made, but agreed that they had reached the limits of what legal research and witness testimony could provide. They were now entering the world of high-frequency trading and forensic accounting, a realm that required a different kind of specialist. The professor, her ever-present mentor, knew exactly who to call. He made a connection for Lena, introducing her to a former student of his, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had been a prodigy in the university's quantitative finance program and was now one of the city's most respected and feared forensic accountants. She was a digital bloodhound, a woman who could find the ghost in any machine. The meeting with Sarah Chen took place not in a quiet library or a sterile coffee shop, but in a bustling, high-tech office in the heart of the financial district, a world away from Lena's recent life. Sarah was the opposite of Arthur Vance. She was sharp, confident, and radiated an almost palpable intensity. She listened to Lena's story with a cool, analytical detachment, her eyes scanning the data Lena had compiled. She was not moved by the emotional weight of the story, but by the intellectual challenge of the puzzle it presented. "He's arrogant," Sarah said after reviewing the files, a small, predatory smile playing on her lips. "These guys always are. They think they're so much smarter than everyone else that they get sloppy. They leave footprints. You just have to know how to look for them." She agreed to take on the case pro bono, not out of charity, but because the chance to take down a titan like Khalid al-Jamil was a challenge she could not resist. She saw him not as a villain, but as a final boss in a game she was supremely skilled at winning. For the next week, Lena and Sarah formed an unlikely but formidable team. Lena provided the legal context, the corporate history, and the human element of the investigation, while Sarah plunged into the digital underworld of Argent TradeWorks. Working from her secure servers, Sarah began to peel back the layers of encryption and misdirection that shielded the firm's activities. She followed the trail of the high-frequency trades that had crippled Innovate Dynamics and her father's company. It was a painstaking process of digital reconstruction, of piecing together fragments of data from dozens of different sources. Lena watched, mesmerized, as Sarah moved through complex financial systems with the grace and precision of a master musician. Sarah wasn't just looking at numbers. She was reading a story of systematic fraud and manipulation, written in the cold, unforgiving language of code and algorithms. The work was all-consuming, a race against a clock they didn't know was ticking. The breakthrough came late one night, a sudden, electrifying moment of discovery in the quiet of Sarah's office. She had managed to bypass a layer of security on an old, archived server belonging to Argent TradeWorks. And there it was, a series of transaction logs, ones that should have been permanently deleted, detailing the precise sequence of short-selling orders placed against the two tech companies. The logs were time-stamped, matching perfectly with the timing of the negative press campaigns and the subsequent stock collapses. But the most damning piece of evidence was the source of the initial funding transfers that had enabled the trades. The money hadn't come from a dozen anonymous offshore accounts. It had come from a single, centralized source, a master account that had been clumsily disguised but was, to Sarah's expert eye, laughably transparent. The account was registered to a holding company, a name Lena knew all too well, Orion Star Holdings. The final link in the chain had been forged. It was the smoking gun, a clear, irrefutable digital trail leading directly from Khalid al-Jamil's personal shell corporation to the illegal stock manipulation that had destroyed her father. At the same time that Lena and Sarah were uncovering the truth, a small, almost imperceptible tremor was running through the foundations of Khalid al-Jamil's empire. In his gleaming penthouse office overlooking Central Park, a place so high above the city that the world below seemed like a toy, he received a routine weekly report from his digital security team. It was a document he usually glanced at for less than a minute before discarding, but one line item caught his eye. It was a flag for an anomalous data query from an external academic network, Columbia University, requesting archived files related to a long-dormant entity, Orion Star Holdings. The name was a distant echo, a minor tool from a forgotten conquest years ago. It meant nothing to him. But Khalid al-Jamil had not built his empire on complacency. He was a predator, and his instincts were finely tuned to the slightest disturbance in his environment. The request was insignificant, probably just some student's research project. But it was an anomaly, and he did not tolerate anomalies. He made a call, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He spoke to his head of security, a man whose entire job was to make problems disappear. There was a query about Orion's star, Khalid said, his tone casual, belying the cold flicker of suspicion in his eyes. I want to know who was asking. I want to know why. And then, I want you to make sure that all related digital and physical records are permanently and irretrievably erased. Consider it a matter of corporate hygiene. He hung up the phone and turned back to his view of the city, the incident already fading from his conscious mind. He had no idea that the insignificant student he imagined was a woman whose life he had destroyed. He had no idea that he had just given the order to destroy the very evidence that had already been found. He was trying to cover a trail that had already led his hunters directly to his door. The ticking clock had just become a detonation timer, and the arrogant titan, blinded by his own power, was completely unaware that his world was about to be blown apart. Back in Sarah's office, the atmosphere was electric. They now possessed the proof, a digital dossier so damning it could not only ruin Khalid financially but could also land him in federal prison for years. The evidence was explosive, a meticulously documented account of systemic predatory fraud. Professor Finch joined them, his face a mixture of academic pride and grim satisfaction as he reviewed their findings. He confirmed that their case was legally airtight. But he also issued a stark warning. Khalid al-Jamil was not a man who would be defeated by a simple lawsuit. He would bury them in litigation, using his billions to drain their resources and entangle them in legal battles for a decade or more. He would use his influence to discredit them, to paint Lena as a vengeful, unstable woman, and Sarah as an unethical hacker. A conventional attack through the legal system was a battle of attrition they could not hope to win. They had the sword, but they could not risk a protracted duel. They needed a single decisive strike. It was Lena who saw the path forward. Her mind, no longer just that of a scholar, had become that of a strategist, a warrior. She had seen Khalid's fatal flaw up close. His arrogance, his absolute need for public dominance, and the respect of his peers. The courts were a private battlefield, but his true vulnerability was his public image. She proposed a different kind of trial, one that would be judged not by a jury of 12, but by a jury of his own world, his investors, his partners, and the global financial media. The perfect venue already existed. In 2 weeks, Apex Global Acquisitions was holding its annual shareholder meeting, a massive, highly publicized event at which Khalid would stand before the world as a conquering hero, a titan of industry at the peak of his power. It was his stage, his theater of triumph, and it was there, in the heart of his own empire, surrounded by the very people whose admiration he craved, that they would deliver the killing blow. The plan was audacious, almost impossibly so, but it was also brilliant in its simplicity. Sarah discovered that a small block of Apex shares was publicly traded, and for a modest sum, they could purchase enough to gain entry to the meeting as legitimate shareholders. Professor Finch used his network to find a sympathetic broker who could make the purchase through a blind trust, ensuring their names would not appear on any preliminary attendee lists. Lena would be the one to go inside. She would not be a waitress this time. She would be a shareholder, with a legal right to be there and a legal right to ask a question during the open Q&A session. She would walk to the microphone, not as a victim seeking pity, but as an avenging angel, armed with irrefutable facts. The final days were a blur of intense preparation. Sarah compiled the evidence into a devastatingly clear presentation. Professor Finch coached Lena, running her through potential questions and challenges, honing her delivery until it was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Lena, for her part, felt a strange, profound calm settle over her. The fear was gone. The grief was gone. All that remained was the pure, crystalline focus of a woman who was about to reclaim her family's name and deliver a justice that was years in the making. The stage for the final confrontation was set. The checkmate was planned. All that was left was for the queen to make her move. The grand ballroom of the Hilton Midtown was not a room. It was a testament to corporate divinity, a modern pantheon built to worship at the altar of capital. The scale was intentionally overwhelming, with ceilings so high they seemed to create their own weather system, and a stage that was less a platform and more a monolithic altar of brushed steel and dark wood. A colossal high-definition screen, spanning the entire width of the stage, displayed the proud, soaring eagle of the Apex Global Acquisitions logo, its wings spread as if to embrace the entire world in its predatory grasp. The air was cool and sterile, smelling of nothing but success, a carefully engineered vacuum devoid of any human scent. The audience, a sea of over 1,000 shareholders, investors, and financial journalists, sat in perfect, orderly rows, their faces upturned in a collective expression of rapt admiration. They were here to witness the coronation of their king, Khalid al-Jamil, and the atmosphere was thick with the quiet, reverent hum of anticipated triumph. Into this temple of power, Lina Hassan walked not as a servant or a ghost, but as a shareholder, a rightful participant in this theater of wealth. She wore a simple, dark gray suit, an armor of professional anonymity that was a world away from her waitress uniform, yet it made her stand out in its understated elegance. Inside her there was no fear, no nervous tremor. The frantic, desperate energy of the past weeks had cooled and hardened into a core of absolute, unshakable calm. Her heart did not pound. It beat with the slow, steady, powerful rhythm of a siege drum, each beat marking the final moments before the walls of the fortress were destined to fall. On stage, Khalid al-Jamil was in his element, a colossus bestriding his world. He paced the stage with the proprietary air of a man who owned not just the company, but the very light and air within the room. His voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, boomed with a practiced, charismatic confidence, weaving a narrative of record profits, aggressive expansion, and market domination. He spoke of synergy and leverage, of disruptive innovation and shareholder value, his corporate jargon a form of high poetry to the assembled congregation. The massive screen behind him shifted from the company logo to a series of dazzling charts and graphs, each one a testament to his Midas touch, showing hockey stick growth curves that defied economic gravity. He was a master showman, and this was his magnum opus. He gestured, he smiled, he made a self-deprecating joke that earned a wave of appreciative laughter. He looked out at the sea of faces, his adoring subjects, and felt the familiar, intoxicating surge of invincibility. He was more than a CEO. He was an architect of destiny, a force of nature, and in this room, on this day, his power felt absolute, eternal, and utterly unassailable. He was completely blind to the single, quiet instrument of his annihilation that was now moving steadily, purposefully, towards a microphone in the center aisle. The Q&A session began, a carefully managed piece of corporate theater with pre-screened questions from major investors. After a few softball inquiries about future growth, the moderator announced they had time for one final question from the floor. This was the moment. Lina stepped forward, her heels making no sound on the thick plush carpet. The walk to the microphone felt both infinitely long and perfectly brief, a journey across a lifetime. She was aware of everything, the subtle shift of heads turning in her direction, the weight of 1,000 curious stares, the way the bright stage lights caught the dust motes dancing in the air. She gripped the cool, solid metal of the microphone stand, grounding herself. Her mind was a sanctuary of perfect clarity. The image of her father's face, not as he was now but as he was before, vibrant and full of life, flashed behind her eyes. This was not for revenge. It was for him. It was for the man whose brilliance had been stolen and discarded, for the name that had been erased. She was not here to destroy a man. She was here to restore a legacy. She took a slow, deep breath, the sterile, refrigerated air filling her lungs. and prepared to speak the truth that would ignite a firestorm. "Mr. Al-Jamil," she began, and her voice, calm and clear, carried through the vast ballroom with an unexpected authority. It was not loud, but it cut through the low murmur of the crowd with the precision of a scalpel. 1,000 heads turned fully in her direction. On stage, Khalid squinted slightly, a flicker of annoyance on his face at this unscheduled interruption. "My name is Lena Hassan, and I am representing a block of shares held in trust." She paused, letting the formal identification establish her right to be there. "We have met before, though you would have no reason to remember me. A few weeks ago, at the Gilded Scepter, I was the waitress you had fired for pointing out a diplomatic inaccuracy in your translator's interpretation of the term, istihwad al-qasri." A ripple of confusion and intrigue went through the audience. On stage, Khalid's practiced smile tightened. A flicker of recognition, then contempt, crossed his features. He remembered the insolent girl. He opened his mouth to deliver a dismissive, condescending remark, to swat her away with a word. But Lena did not give him the chance. "I am not here to discuss my termination," she continued, her voice gaining a cold, hard edge. "I am here to discuss the business model that informs both your professional conduct and your personal character, a model, it turns out, I am intimately familiar with." "If you could direct your attention to the screen," she said, her voice now a command. In the control booth, a tech hired by Sarah Chen hit a single key. The soaring eagle of the Apex logo behind Khalid vanished, replaced instantly by a scanned copy of a legal document, the final acquisition agreement for her father's company, Hassan Innovations. The camera zoomed in on the bottom of the page, on the name of the acquiring shell corporation, Orion Star Holdings, and the bold, arrogant signature scrawled beside it. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. "This document," Lena's voice narrated, cold and clinical, "details the hostile takeover of a small, innovative tech firm 10 years ago. A firm driven into bankruptcy by a campaign of targeted market manipulation." The screen changed, now displaying a dizzying array of transaction logs, a cascade of data from Argent TradeWorks. "These are the records of a coordinated, illegal short-selling scheme funded directly by Orion Star Holdings, designed to artificially devalue the company before its seizure." The evidence flashed across the screen, one damning slide after another. Emails, server logs, encrypted communications Sarah had unearthed. "A seizure you personally authorized, Mr. Al-Jamil." The founder of that company, my father, Amir Hassan, was left with nothing. The stress of that corporate annihilation, that coercive seizure, resulted in a catastrophic stroke that has left him unable to speak or walk to this day. The effect in the room was one of total, catastrophic system failure. The carefully constructed reality of Khalid al-Jamil's triumph shattered into a million pieces. His face, projected in stunning high definition on the screens flanking the stage, was a mask of horror. The confident, charismatic tan drained away, leaving a pasty, sickly gray. A sheen of cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He stared at the signature on the screen, his own name, a ghost from a past he had buried and forgotten, now resurrected to condemn him. He opened and closed his mouth, but no sound came out. The corporate poetry, the confident jargon, all of it was gone, leaving only the sputtering, impotent rage of a king suddenly stripped bare in front of his entire court. "Security!" he finally managed to croak, his voice a strangled, pathetic thing. "Cut the feed! Get her out of here!" But it was far too late. The journalists were already scrambling, their fingers flying across their phones, broadcasting the corporate execution live to the world. His investors and board members were staring at him not with admiration, but with the cold, calculating horror of men watching their fortunes evaporate in real time. The foundation of his empire, built on a bedrock of fear and a facade of invincibility, was turning to dust before his very eyes. His public image, his reputation, his legacy, All of it was undergoing a complete and irreversible annihilation, delivered not by a rival corporation, but by the quiet, steady voice of a woman he had deemed unworthy of even a moment's notice. Type "Justice" in the comments if you got chills when Lena Hassan finally exposed the truth. The aftermath was not a slow decline, it was a spectacular implosion. The Apex Global shareholder meeting became the epicenter of a financial earthquake that sent shockwaves through the global markets. Within hours, the story was the lead on every major news network. The Securities and Exchange Commission, armed with the dossier Sarah Chen had anonymously provided, announced a formal investigation before the market closed. Shareholders, led by the very American investor from the restaurant, filed a class-action lawsuit that froze Khalid's personal and corporate assets. His board of directors, seeing the irrefutable evidence, convened an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove him. Khalid al-Jamil, the Titan, the king, was a pariah. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, facing a future of depositions, criminal indictments, and the utter ruin of the empire he had built on the broken lives of others. His name, once a synonym for power, was now a byword for fraud and disgrace. He had been undone by his own fatal flaw, the arrogant belief that some people simply did not matter. A week later, Lena received a call. It was from Robert Sterling, the American investor who had witnessed her first act of defiance at the Gilded Scepter. He met her for coffee, not in an opulent temple of power, but in a quiet, unassuming cafe in her own neighborhood in Queens. He looked at her with an expression of profound respect. He told her that he had been disgusted by Khalid's behavior that day, but he had been mesmerized by her courage and integrity. He had followed the news of the shareholder meeting with a sense of awe. He explained that his own firm was creating a new senior position, a role in their ethics and compliance division focused on investigating and preventing the very kind of predatory corporate behavior Khalid had perfected. It required a unique combination of skills, a deep understanding of international law, a forensic mind for complex financial structures, and an unshakable moral compass. "The position is yours, Miss Hassan," he said simply, "if you want it. It's a chance to be a guardian, to ensure that what happened to your father doesn't happen to other innovators." It was not just a job offer, it was a restoration. It was a chance to reclaim her rightful place in the world, not as a victim, but as a protector. Lena accepted. Her new life began not with a celebration, but with a quiet visit. She went to the new care facility, a bright, peaceful place with gardens and expert therapists, a place she could now afford without a second thought. Her father was sitting in a wheelchair by a sunny window, looking out at the trees. The stroke had taken much from him, but the light in his eyes, the spark of the brilliant man he was, remained. She sat with him, holding his hand, and told him everything. She told him about the restaurant, about Khalid, about the library, and about the final confrontation. She told him that his name, Amir Hassan, was no longer a forgotten footnote, but was now known as a symbol of integrity, the catalyst for a great reckoning. He could not speak, he could not reply, but as she spoke, a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, and he squeezed her hand. It was a squeeze of recognition, of pride, of love. It was all the victory she would ever need. Lena Hassan had not only brought a Titan to justice, she had restored her father's honor, reclaimed her own destiny, and in doing so had begun the work of using her extraordinary gifts to build a world where the brilliant and the good would no longer be the prey of the arrogant and the cruel. If Lena's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.